Now we're going to widen this out a bit, Jack and Dennis, and we're going to talk about China, and both of you, but particularly you, Jack, spoke a lot about China in your remarks. And this, after all, is a very seminal moment when it seems as though we are ratcheting up the pressure on both countries through extra tariffs. Now, in your speech, you gave some very interesting and quite hard-hitting remarks in your low-key and very studied way by saying that it looks as though America is going to be left out of some of the trade deals that might be done in Asia. You also spoke, I think, very convincingly about the fact that the Iranians are now talking to the Chinese about potentially using the renminbi in oil pricing and so on. A lot of what you said sounded as though Mr. Trump's policy secretly seems to be a China-first policy. Could you elaborate on this, whether there may be all kinds of countervailing effects on China, which may actually end up strengthening the hand of China in Asia, in Europe, and in other parts of the world?
Well, David, I think that to have the United States step back from over 70 years of global leadership when the other major economy and other major power in the world is China is ill-advised. Now, I am a big advocate of the US and China having very constructive relations. I'm not a big advocate of the United States kind of abandoning its leadership role. And I think that that is what we're watching happen, at least for this moment in time. Withdrawing from TPP was a big mistake. TPP was not what the Chinese thought it was. It was not the US coming in trying to keep China out. We always took the view that set high standards. When China meets those standards, welcome China in. To have the US leave that agreement means that it's now out of what is, as we heard just earlier, Lord Desai, you said, the largest, fastest growing part of the global economy. It doesn't mean we'll go to zero, but our share of it will not be what it should be. I think that the idea that right now in the global engagement, the United States appears to be attacking a world order that we built. And China now appears to be defending that world order. One could not have made up a scenario like that.
No, you said that very convincingly, also vis-a-vis the NATO summit. But taking this monetary aspect, Dennis, where you are the expert, the issue that the specter that you helped to raise there about renminbi internationalization, do you really think that the renminbi could one day, in the not-too-distant future, be a real challenger to the dollar, and that the American retreat into what looks a very bilateral type of worldview away from multilateralism, could that be actually giving the Chinese some extra leeway to pursue some quite ambitious currency plans?
I think it's the intention of the Chinese over a long period of time to make the renminbi a serious reserve currency. But they're patient, and they realize a lot of transitions have to occur. It is not an easy task. A few years ago, I would have argued that the dollar will be dominant for quite some time. Today, it's about 62, 63% of reserve currencies around the world, and that the dollar would gradually lose relative position to more of a multi-currency reserve currency regime. I still basically hold to that view, but I think the events of the last year could accelerate the desire of both China and other countries to get off the dollar standard, if you will, or to at least have an option or have an alternative to the dollar, whether it be the effect of sanctions, whether it be some distaste with the way the U.S. conducts itself internationally. I think it is therefore not in the interest of the United States to accelerate the elimination of the exorbitant privilege.
If I could just say, David, I agree with that. I think it's a mistake to think of this as an on-off switch. I think that over time, the U.S.'s dominance was going to start to erode, as Dennis said. I think the idea that we would have a policy that almost forces the foot down on the accelerator, even if it just takes what's a 40, 50-year process and makes it a 25 to 40-year process is profoundly not in the U.S. national interest.
Meghnad, perhaps you could comment on that, because you've done a lot of study into the kind of extraterritoriality of the United States monetary power. Again, could this be countervailing some of the influences that the tariff policies are having now on the world order?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is that the power of the dollar is also because of the financial depth of the New York market. I mean, China had, what, 4 trillion reserves in the Treasury bill.
It was actually only 3
They
trillion these
withdrew-
days,
yeah,
but
they
it's still
withdrew
real
a-
money.
Yeah, they withdrew $1 trillion, and the Treasury bill market did not bat an eyelid. So you can't become a reserve currency just by, just like that. You have to have seriously free capital markets. London had when sterling was dominant. London had that depth when sterling was dominant. United States has that depth right now. The euro has no depth in its financial markets, nor does the renminbi. And I think it will take some time before people will have confidence that they can put their assets into renminbi and take them out. See, that depth of liquidity will take some time to build up. Now, I have a very unorthodox view about Donald Trump. I think I am one of the few people who actually like him. I actually...
So Meghnad has got some very quaint tastes.
I predicted he would get elected when nobody was predicting he'd get elected, and I did it in print. No, I think, it's a very interesting thing that America traditionally, all through the post-war period, the rhetoric was America is the most powerful country. It can meet any challenge, face any problem, and overcome it. Every president and inaugural speech was a triumphalist speech. And look at Donald Trump's speech. It is like, Bernie Sanders could have said it. We are in trouble. We are no longer the great thing. We have drug crisis. We have kind of miserable sort of outcomes in life. Now, it may be that he was highlighting a part of the country which is not the majority part, but it is there. It got him elected. And I think he's genuinely worried, and his constituents genuinely worried, that America no longer is the top dog. And in that case, how do you do a nationalist economic policy? Well, first thing you say, listen, we've been paying for all of you guys for your defense and so on, but thank you very much, you are now prosperous enough, you should be able to afford it. I think the NATO complaint he has is absolutely justified. I think Germany is behaving very cynically and has for years not paid the proper price. And apart from France and Britain, very few European countries have paid the proper price for NATO.
I'd like to slightly de-Trumpify the conversation here a bit, but maybe I could just ask you one thing, Jack, regarding what you've just said here, Meghnad. No, just
really
to...
don't like that.
No, because
I'm finished.
No, I know you're not finished.
I'm
That is why I'm interrupting you, because I know you're not finished.
More unorthodox.
No, but we only got 7 minutes left. I mean, some people do say that Mr. Trump is actually saying out loud in a slightly impolite way what Mr. Obama, that nice Mr. Obama, was thinking all along, i.e. the Europeans are not pulling their weight.
Look, there is a legitimate argument. We made the argument for 8 years. The Bush administration made the argument for 8 years that Europe needed to do more. And I agree that Germany, because it has the fiscal capacity, is to blame for not having done more. Now, with that said, this is not the way to achieve the goal of Europe having a 2% of GDP commitment to its defense. You look at what the Atlantic Alliance has done to create stability, security, and economic prosperity in Europe, the United States, and the world. You go back 250 years in European history before, that's not what you saw. So you have to be careful about how you take on a legitimate issue. So I'm all for confronting Europeans to bear their fair share. I'm not of the view that it's in America's interest to act as if we get nothing out of the European alliance.
No, I think that's a good point. I'd like to get on to ASEAN. I'd like to ask you, Dennis, we're talking here with a very notable audience of people who are all at the hub of this high technology center of Singapore. We're talking in the future about lots of trade and investment in intangible goods, services, technology, and so on. How big a role do you think China will play in all that? And do you now think that this business about the Chinese stealing our technology is a little bit passé because they've got so much technology these days? It might be good if we stole some of their technology. In other words, they're going to be now quite interested in patent protection, and the boot will be on the other foot in some ways when you're talking about trade and investment flows with the Chinese. They're going to be playing in the adults' league, and shouldn't we be dealing with them as adults?
Well, it may be an issue whose slightly time has passed, but I have to say, without being an apologist for the Trump administration, I think they have a point, and that is the behavior of China has been a form of cyber industrial espionage for a number of years. I think they have been absolutely dedicated to building a country and doing that by the adoption of other people's ideas and other people's technology. And that is a core commitment. The 2025 program is just an expression of that commitment. So I'm sympathetic to the view that you have to take them on intellectual property. I agree with Jack Lew that it's a question of how you take on someone. And what I don't think has been well thought through is the cost and benefit of the method by which you go about trying to correct something that is improper in the international scheme. Now, your question is, have they gotten so far that we should be stealing their ideas through hacking? Basically.
In some sectors, they have made rapid advances, and of course, they mean to do that even more, don't they, in the future?
I'm not sure I would buy that position. Technology marches on. The quality of research, the quality of innovation in the United States is such that in many, many areas, the United States is bound to continue to be among the leaders, if not the leader in the technology. And I think if not engaged or not confronted, there is a continuing risk that ideas that are protected by intellectual property law are stolen.
I think if you look at the trend over the last few years, it's progress that we're not talking as much about theft of intellectual property as purchase of intellectual property. But I think the appetite that China has for buying technology from the US and Europe kind of disproves the thesis that they're already in the lead. They're gaining ground. They're putting more resources into artificial intelligence and robotics than we are in the United States right now. But that gets back to the fiscal choices we're making. If we don't invest in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the question you're asking will have a different answer. And that's very short-sighted.
Meghnad, we've just had the Chinese Prime Minister in Europe, specifically seeing Angela Merkel. Do you think that the fact that there are now these tariff skirmishes, protectionism in the United States is going to make the Germans, for example, more likely to sell, as Jack says, the Chinese are looking to buy technology, the Germans are going to be more likely to sell some of their technology firms to the Chinese now because the Germans are looking for any port in a storm, and they're thinking of the Chinese as like a friendly nation these days. So do you think that this could have a positive effect maybe on the ability of the Chinese to buy technology from Europe?
No, I think obviously the Chinese will want to buy technology from elsewhere, and they'll be willing sellers. You know, I don't think that the Germans had any feeling, as the Americans have, that this is a national security issue, in some sense. You know, so yes, and anybody else who wants to sell technology to China, Chinese will buy. And my view is that, as Donald said. The problem is there theft? Is there a violation of intellectual property rights in China's behavior? Now there are convinced people in the United States currently affecting Donald Trump's policy that there is a theft element, it is surreptitious, and they want to prevent that. So I think the tariff war is a proxy for this war. And I think what Donald Trump wants is he will settle the tariff war on goods if he can win on the technology war.
Good. Well, we're getting to the final minute, and I don't want this to go to a penalty shootout. I want us to end on time. I'm going to ask all the three gentlemen in the order in which they're spoken to speak for about 15 seconds each on, say, we're sitting here in, say, 15 years' time. What are going to be the big issues, starting with you, Jack, and giving you, Meghnad, the last word? Because if I don't give you the last word, you're going to take it anyway, probably. And saying what are going to be the big issues dividing or uniting the US and China in 10 to 15 years?
I think that if the U.S. Pendulum swings back, you will see the two largest economies of the world continuing to compete, to engage, to avoid having economic conflict become geopolitical conflict. It should be in everyone's interest to avoid that.
Would you be so sanguine? I mean, do you think there's going to be a real war rather than simply a kind of tariff skirmish?
I think this too will pass. At least I'm hopeful that it will pass. But I do think there's a sort of physics involved in how the world is evolving. Demographics has a lot to do with that. So I just asked the thought experiment. At a time in which per capita income is closer to equal around the world, and 1/6 of mankind is in China, and the US is maybe 400 million, how will the world be organized? That's sort of what we're at the early stages of fighting out now.
Meghnad, final word. I mean, for you who thinks in historical dimensions, 10 to 15 years, it's like a nanosecond, isn't it? Give us your view.
I think the world is going to be as different 15 years from now as it was 15 years previously. 15 years previously, we were not worried about financial crisis or anything like that. China had not become as big. But I think China will slow down because demographics are very bad. Its growth rate is already slowing down. And there are other countries will come up, maybe from ASEAN, maybe India will get its act together, we don't know. Africa is yet to come. So I think there are a number of growth potential regions which are not yet there. And they could be there, but that will depend upon their political stability, their innovativeness and so on. But I would say that the next country in line, and not because I was born there, is India. It can actually get its act together, then it will make a lot of difference to the global economy.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. There's been a wonderful discussion. I'm going to give way to Steve. I'd like to just make one remark, which is a big vote of thanks to our three panelists, Jack, Meghnad and Dennis, and also to make one prediction: in 15 years' time, England will still be looking forward to winning the World Cup.
Yeah.